This video explores a natural steady state within complex plane dynamics. We define key states. Red represents false on the negative x-axis, blue represents true on the positive x-axis, and green represents neutral zero at the origin. We will move through three phases: initial setup, collapse, and the Big Bang.
This video is the physical mandate, the Unified Field Theory of Human Conduct, UFT-HC, and the thermodynamic collapse of fiat systems. Welcome to the formal academic defense of the Unified Field Theory of Human Conduct. This presentation bridges the physical sciences, constitutional law, and macroeconomic theory to demonstrate the undeniable thermodynamic limits of our global civilization. This presentation has been specifically engineered for universal accessibility, ensuring that the natural laws of physics are available to all sovereign producers. Truth resides on the real axis of the complex plane, and it is accessible to everyone. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Main title: Prologue, The Ultimate Charter of Civilization. Subtitle: The Unified Field Theory of Human Conduct. Point 1. The End of the Scalar Lie. Human civilization can no longer operate on the one-dimensional mathematics of fiat currency and accounting plurals. Point 2. The physical anchor, the positive x-axis. The monetary, legal, political, and economic systems must be overhauled and rebuilt strictly upon the universal laws of physics, logic, and set theory. End of visual text. Now, the academic commentary. Welcome. You are about to view the mathematical foundation for a new global reality. For decades, the public has been forced to accept a profound deception. Our monetary systems, our courts, and our governments have operated upon a system of imaginary money and logical zeros. They have extracted real human life, real biological time, and real kinetic energy using the mathematical fraud of fiat debt. This presentation marks the end of that era. I direct your attention to the image on the right side of this screen. That is the CRC Handbook of Chemistry and Physics. It contains the absolute, immutable laws of thermodynamics, mass, and kinetic energy. The Unified Field Theory of Human Conduct establishes that human civilization is a physical system. Therefore, it must be governed by physical laws. No banking ledger, no parliamentary statute, and no judicial oath can overwrite the conservation of mass and energy contained within that book. We will now begin the formal proof. We will separate real money from imaginary money. We will expose the thermodynamic theft hidden within the banking and justice systems, and we will lay down the ultimate charter for the sovereign producers. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Slide title: The Epistemological Crisis of Macroeconomics. Point 1. The 1971 decoupling. The removal of the gold standard severed the global financial system from physical reality. Point 2. The fiat illusion. Creating currency numbers without physical work attempts to bypass the first law of thermodynamics. Point 3. The logical zero. A system that allows creation from nothing introduces a fatal mathematical paradox. End of visual text. Now the academic commentary. Today we are not discussing fiscal policy or subjective legal opinions. We are discussing absolute physics. Modern macroeconomics is facing a fatal epistemological crisis. It has completely detached from physical reality. When fiat currency severed its link to physical commodities in 1971, the global system entered a state of scientific default. The system now allows governments to create value numbers out of thin air, attempting to bypass the first law of thermodynamics. But in absolute physics, no human legislation can magically create 1 joule of kinetic energy. It cannot manifest 1 kilogram of matter. If the foundation of a system allows for creation from nothing, it generates a logical zero. It must inevitably collapse. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Main title: The UFT-HC Lexicon. Defining the Complex Plane. Subtitle: Money as a Thermodynamic Vector Array, Overlapping Cartesian and Cylindrical Coordinates. End of visual text. Now, the academic commentary. Before we examine the historical evidence, we must establish the UFT-HC mathematical lexicon. We must discard the illusion that money is a flat, scalar number. In absolute physics, money is a thermodynamic vector array. It exists on a complex plane where Cartesian and cylindrical coordinates overlap. We define this array as z equals x, I, y, and theta. X represents the real axis, actual physical work, kinetic energy, and real joules. The imaginary axis, IY, represents fiat currency, administrative promises, or unbacked deficits. Z is the absolute physical magnitude of the economic state. Finally, theta is the moral angle. It measures the exact degree of systemic inversion between physical truth and administrative fiction. Recall that Pythagoras' theorem provides the exact formula to distinguish flat scalar addition from the true vector addition of a right-angled triangle. Yet, modern frameworks like Generally Accepted Accounting Practice, or GAAP, and International Financial Reporting Standards, or IFRS, completely ignore this geometry. They are built on administrative concept rather than physical theory. Look at the interactive simulator on your screen. When the vector is dragged into the negative IY deficit space, the scalar accounting ledger blindly adds the numbers to hide the loss, but the moral angle, theta, physically inverts. If you are viewing this at a live interactive station, you may now test this vector math yourself before we proceed to the systemic evidence. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Slide title: Mapping Money Value on the Complex Plane. It is Z, which has three components, namely X, I, Y, with an angle theta. Part 1. The two sides of money value in a complex plane. The real money is named along the X-axis, standing for stuff money. It represents absolute physical reality, real kinetic work energy, and biological labor in units of joules. Gold and electricity are examples of real commodity money X. The imaginary money axis is named as IY, standing for promise money. It represents abstract, fiat IOUs, or debt, a mathematical construct requiring zero physical energy to create. Part 2. The status of promise money. Broke or empty is negative IY, which means defaulted debt, an empty wallet requiring real work to fill. Funded or full is positive IY, which means fueled by real-world services, allowing produced goods to circulate. Part 3. The big ideas. Point 1. Vector Z is the vector sum of independent components X and IY. Point 2. The 90-degree problem. Extracting physical value using abstract value creates an intractable energy imbalance, violating the barter principle. Point 3. No free lunch. Abstract arithmetic, like fractional reserve banking, cannot generate real physical work. Point 4. The goodness factor theta. The moral compass angle of vector Z made with the positive X-axis. End of visual text. Now, the academic commentary. To understand this, we map money value onto the Cartesian complex plane. The value point is the vector Z, defined by the coordinates X, IY, and the angle theta. Look at part 1, the two sides of value. The real money axis, positive X, represents stuff money. This is the solid physical truth, like gold. It is the honest, unchangeable, physical work energy, measured in joules. The imaginary money axis, positive IY, represents promise money. This is the abstract IOU, or debt. It is a mathematical idea that costs zero energy to create. Move to part 2, the status of promise money. If the status is empty, the value plunges into negative IY. The real energy is 0 joules. It is an empty wallet waiting to be filled by actual work. But if the status is funded, the value is positive IY. This means the fiat money is fueled by real-world services, allowing goods made by the nation's producers to circulate. Finally, part 3, the big ideas. Vector Z is the vector sum of X and IY. Trying to pull physical value from positive X using abstract value from positive IY creates the 90-degree problem. Because these are strictly independent dimensions, it inherently generates a fundamental and intractable energy imbalance, completely contravening the barter principle. The core discovery is this: when an institution operates on the imaginary axis, but continuously consumes real energy from the real axis, it acts as a thermodynamic parasite. They are draining the closed-loop power supply of our civilization. Furthermore, there is no free lunch. Abstract mathematics, like fractional reserve banking or interest calculation, cannot inherently generate a net increase in real, physical work. Finally, we have the goodness factor theta. Theta is the moral compass angle of the vector Z, revealing the thermodynamic honesty of the entire system. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Main title: The Epistemological Fallacy. Subtitle: The Scalar Lie versus Vector Truth. End of visual text. Now, the academic commentary. We now arrive at the core mathematical explanation of the modern world, the epistemological fallacy. Law uses scalar Z addition. Physics uses vector Z addition. To expose this crisis, we use a flawless geometric proof, the pristine 3, 4, 5 Pythagorean triangle on the complex plane. When a court or a bank looks at a ledger, they use scalar addition. They simply add the numbers together. 3 plus 4 equals 7. They claim the system has a value of 7. That is our present fiat accounting fallacy and our current legal tender. By claiming a value of 7, the system is claiming 2 units of phantom value that do not physically exist. However, physics dictates that the actual physical magnitude of that system is only 5. When a physicist looks at reality, they use vector addition. When the real axis x is 3 and the imaginary axis y is 4, the vector sum is 5. The moral angle is positive 53.1 degrees. This is the positive state, where z equals 5. But what happens when we introduce fiat debt? When x is 3 and y is negative 4, we have an account deficit. The vector sum remains 5, but the moral angle is now inverted to negative 53.1 degrees. This is system inversion. It is the parasitic state. This difference of 2 units comes entirely from the logical zero. This is a serious violation of physical law, and someone will definitely be injured as a result. Conclusion. The judicial and accounting systems use elementary, flat scalar arithmetic to mask a 90-degree thermodynamic drain on all the sovereign producers. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Slide title Axiom 1. The Thermodynamic Conservation of Finance. Point 1. The barter principle. All legitimate economic exchange must be strictly anchored to physical reality. Point 2. Energy cannot be created. Energy joules in equals joules out. Wealth is the accumulation of real physical work over time. Point 3. The 90-degree phase shift. Fiat currency operating strictly on the imaginary IY axis while extracting from the positive X axis creates an irresolvable thermodynamic asymmetry. Point 4. The anti-multiplier principle. You cannot amplify physical work through abstract numerical multipliers. Fractional reserve banking and official rates are key examples. End of visual text. Now the academic commentary. Since economics cannot violate physics, we establish our first axiom, the thermodynamic conservation of finance. In the unified field theory, this is the barter principle. The first law of thermodynamics dictates that energy can only be transferred. It cannot be created. This means that all legitimate economic exchange must be strictly anchored to physical reality. The current financial system uses interest rates and fiat printing to apply dimensionless multipliers to physical prices. In physics, this violates the anti-multiplier principle. You cannot simply multiply physical work against the conservation of mass energy within a closed system. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Slide title Axiom 2. Time-energy arbitrage. Point 1. The illusion of future funding. Using abstract mechanisms to fund current liabilities by taxing unborn generations. Point 2. Newton's third law. For every fiat asset created out of nothing, a corresponding liability, specifically inflation and entropy, is forced onto the real axis. Point 3. Splitting the zero. Wealth is not created. A logical zero is simply split into 2 opposing illusions. End of visual text. Now, the academic commentary. When a system forces imaginary numbers to be recognized as legal tender, it triggers Axiom 2. Governments attempt to use abstract financial mechanisms to fund future liabilities. But you cannot transfer today's surplus into the future without demanding real physical work from unborn generations. This creates a logical zero. And a logical zero is not just an accounting error. It enforces strict mathematical symmetry. Newton's third law states that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. When a government prints money and claims an asset, the physical universe forces a balance. It creates an equal liability, manifesting as inflation and entropy, on the other end of the system. The central banks have not created wealth. They have merely split a zero into 2 opposing illusions. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Slide title Axiom 3. The historical falsification. Point 1. Falsifying the fiat necessity. The Zhou dynasty maintained systemic stability for 800 years without fiat currency. Point 2. The distributed barter anchor. A system anchored entirely in real commodities and actual work energy is on the positive x-axis. Point 3. Mathematical proof. A single counterexample absolutely falsifies a universally quantified proposition. End of visual text. Now, the academic commentary. Modern economics assumes that fiat currency is both necessary and possesses intrinsic value. This assumption is completely falsified by history. The Zhou dynasty in China maintained systemic stability for nearly 800 years. Why? Because they did not have fiat currency. Their economic system was strictly anchored to a distributed, physical barter system. It was built entirely on the real axis of actual commodities and work energy. The people never overspent more than their income. They did not create imaginary vectors to execute cross-generational energy theft. Therefore, they achieved maximum systemic longevity. In mathematics, a single counterexample is sufficient to absolutely destroy a universal proposition. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Slide title Axiom 4. The set theory of society. Point 1. The nested hierarchy. The empty set is a subset of the individual, which is a subset of the family, which is a subset of the organization, which is a subset of the nation, which is a subset of the universe superset. Point 2. The producers. The absolute sovereign creditors. They generate real work energy joules through commodity and labor. Point 3. The non-producers. Government strictly belongs to a subordinate subset. It generates no intrinsic value. Point 4. Universal J sovereignty. Sovereignty physically belongs exclusively to the producers. Government statute sovereignty is mathematically subordinate. End of visual text. Now, the academic commentary. To resolve the crisis of jurisdiction, we must apply mathematical set theory. Society is a nested hierarchy, extending from the individual to the universe. In this set, the producers, the individuals and families who generate real work energy joules, are the absolute sovereign creditors. The government, strictly speaking, belongs only to the subset of non-producers. The government itself generates zero intrinsic value. It merely provides the empty, conceptual vessel of fiat currency. And that vessel must be charged by the real physical labor of civil servants to facilitate barter. Therefore, universal J sovereignty physically belongs exclusively to the producers. The statute sovereignty claimed by governments is, mathematically and thermodynamically, subordinate. This proves that the people possess the absolute physical right to self-governance. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Main title: The Universal Supreme Constitution. Subtitle: The Thermodynamic Reformation of Global Society. Point 1 establishes the hierarchy of law. Human law is subordinate to physics. Point 2 rejects the imaginary axis, stating that extracting kinetic energy to fund fiat deficits guarantees collapse. Point 3 introduces the Thermodynamic Reformation and the GAERT decree, demanding alignment with the positive X vector of truth. End of visual text. Now, the structural audit. We begin with the absolute foundation. The legacy system operates under the delusion that human administrators can legislate reality. They cannot. Under the Universal Supreme Constitution of the UFTHC, we recognize a strict hierarchy of law. The statutes of politicians and the common law of judges are completely subordinate to the natural laws of physics, specifically thermodynamics and the conservation of energy. If an administrative law violates the physical capacity of the human foundation, that law is a logical zero. It is structurally void. For too long, the administrative legal financial nexus has operated on the imaginary y-axis. They legislate fiat deficits and extract the literal kinetic life force of the working class to subsidize their failures. This is not just illegal. It is a mathematical guarantee of societal collapse. Therefore, a thermodynamic reformation is required. We enact the GAERT decree. We demand that all legal and economic structures return to kinetic equilibrium and align strictly with the positive x-axis of objective, physical truth. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Main title: The Physics of Reality, Mass, Energy, and Biological Validators. Point 1 defines the plus x-axis as mass and energy, governed by the CRC Handbook. It notes energy is invisible, but measurable, providing the electromagnetic energy density equation, U equals 1/2 epsilon E squared plus 1/2 mu H squared. Point 2 explains that biological receptors, specifically the cochlea and bony labyrinth of the ear, transfer this energy into the nervous system, making math and music universal languages. Point 3 states fiat statutes have zero mass and zero energy density. End of visual text. Now, the structural audit. We must cancel the illusion that administrative statutes have value. To do this, we consult the CRC Handbook, the ultimate collection of natural law. The positive x-axis is defined strictly by mass and energy. Energy is often invisible, but it is always measurable. An electric field is a vector of force per coulomb. We can calculate the exact field energy density in any space by summing the electric and magnetic contributions. How does a biological human interact with this invisible energy? Through biological receptors. Consider the ear. The cochlea and the bony labyrinth are physical transducers. They capture invisible mechanical sound waves, like the natural pitch of musical notes, and convert that physical energy directly into the nervous system. This is why mathematics and music are the two universal languages for all people across the world. They are rooted in absolute physical frequencies. Now look at the imaginary y-axis. A fiat statute or a legal jargon has zero mass. Its electromagnetic energy density is exactly zero. It cannot trigger the cochlea. Because it has no mass and no energy, it is physically void. The administrators rule using ghosts. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Main title: Vector Accounting and the Moral Cross Product. Subtitle: The Duality of the Rotational Operator. The slide contrasts scalar accounting, which hides direction, with vector accounting, which maps the physics of human conduct. It outlines the flow of action along the axes and defines the moral cross product, where positive I cross positive j yields positive k, and positive I cross negative j yields negative k. End of visual text. Now, the structural audit. We must unify the ledger, just as Maxwell unified electricity and magnetism. Scalar accounting is dead. It is a tool of the administration to hide their theft. We must transition to vector accounting. In the unified field theory of human conduct, the letter I has duality. It is an imaginary number in mathematics, but in physics, it is a rotational operator. It represents the time evolution of a man's action. Visualize the flow of human action as discrete units, or beads, moving along a coordinate plane. Actions moving strictly along the positive x-axis remain true. Actions along the negative x-axis remain false. But when action travels along the vertical axis, it must cross the 0 point. As time goes by, an upward action crossing 0 switches the state from false to truth. A downward action crossing 0 corrupts truth into falsehood. This brings us to the vector cross product. When a positive vector crosses a positive action, it yields a positive k-vector. This is the positive moral angle, the natural state of a society supporting itself. But when a positive vector crosses a negative downward action, like the administrative theft we audited, it yields a negative k-vector. This is the exact mathematical proof of the parasitic state. The administrators operate at a minus 45-degree moral angle, generating negative k-vectors. Their accounting is a physical violation of parity. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Main title: The all-caps exploit. Typographical legal fictions. Point 1 notes the structural integrity of Chinese characters versus the malleable English alphabet. Point 2 defines the proper case name as the biological positive X-man and the all-caps name as the imaginary y-axis legal fiction. Point 3 explains the courtroom trap. Courts charge the all-caps ghost, tricking the living man into accepting the physical extraction. End of visual text. Now, the structural audit. To maintain the thermodynamic sync, the legacy courts must bridge the gap between their imaginary axis and our physical reality. They do this through a typographical exploit. Traditional Chinese characters are absolute concepts. They cannot be manipulated into upper and lower cases. But English is phonetic. The legacy system uses this flaw to create a twin. When you are born, you are a physical, biological entity on the positive x-axis. But the administration creates an all-uppercase version of your name on paper. This all-caps name is a corporate entity, a legal fiction existing entirely on the imaginary y-axis. It is a logical zero. When the court wants to extract energy from you, they cannot legally attack your physical body without violating habeas corpus. So they issue the charge to the all-caps ghost. When you walk into the courtroom and answer to that all-caps name, the trap snaps shut. The judge uses your linguistic confusion to attach their imaginary fiat debt directly to your physical biological energy. This is how they pass the liability of the nexus onto the living man. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Main title: The Thermodynamic Bill of Rights and Habeas Corpus. Point 1 defines habeas corpus, Yan Sun Bu Wu Ling, as the thermodynamic boundary preventing kinetic restriction without a delta Z equals 0 equation. Point 2 defines the Bill of Rights, Kyun Le Fat An, as a mathematical ledger of forbidden boundaries. Point 3 defines freedom of speech, Yin Lun Zi Yao, as the data vector required to correct entropy. End of visual text. Now, the structural audit. To guarantee global acceptance of the UFT-HC, we must translate human rights from political philosophy into inescapable physics, anchored by the absolute integrity of traditional Chinese. In legacy courts, habeas corpus is a fragile tradition. In our universe, it is Yan Sun Bu Wu Ling, a strict thermodynamic boundary. A fiat entity operating on the imaginary y-axis cannot restrict the positive x kinetic movement of a biological human body without balancing the equation. If the state cannot empirically prove that you destroyed physical joules, the delta z equation does not equal zero. Therefore, any arrest is an administrative kidnapping. They have no mathematical jurisdiction. This elevates the Kun Lei Fat on the Bill of Rights. It is a mathematical ledger of boundaries that the imaginary axis is physically forbidden from crossing. Furthermore, Yin Lun Zi Yao, freedom of speech, is not just a right to talk. It is the fundamental vector of information required to expose the factual scalar lie. Suppressing speech is the act of intentionally blinding the thermodynamic audit. By locking these rights into the laws of physics and the integrity of logographic characters, we make them structurally unbreakable. This concludes Chapter 1. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Main title: The Societal Tetrahedron, Legacy Inversion versus GAERT Reset. Point 1 defines the legacy inversion, where a massive administrative apex crushes the biological foundation to extract energy. Point 2 defines the GAERT reset, restoring the natural geometry where the productive foundation rests firmly on the ground. Point 3 introduces the structural remedy of two-level governance, dividing power between the wealth-generating nano-government and the zero-deficit macro-government. End of visual text. Now the structural audit. Welcome to Chapter 2. We have established the thermodynamic laws. Now we must examine the geometry of human society. The current legacy system operates as an inverted societal tetrahedron. Imagine a massive heavy pyramid balancing precariously on its tip. That tip is the biological working-class foundation. The administrative, legal, and financial nexus has placed themselves as the massive weight crushing down upon it. Because they operate on the imaginary y-axis, they generate no physical energy. They must extract it by crushing the positive x foundation. This is the ultimate cause of the thermodynamic squeeze. It is a mathematical guarantee of collapse. The GAERT reset is the structural remedy. We must flip the tetrahedron. In a physically stable society, the broad productive foundation of the people rests firmly on the ground. We call this the nano-government, the family unit, the true sovereign generators of physical wealth. The macro-government sits at the apex, strictly constrained by a zero-deficit mandate, supported only by the organic surplus of the foundation. It is an impersonal administrator, not a parasitic sink. We must now audit the case studies to prove why this two-level governance is the only mathematically viable future. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Slide title: The Structural Remedy and Two-Level Governance. Point 1. The GAERT Intervention. Global Audit on Economic Resource Transactions. Re-anchoring systems to the law of financial conservation. Point 2. Two-level governance. Level 1. Administration and AI. I must be redesigned to think with physicist logic. Level 2. Supreme Supervisory Board. A logical zero engine, operated by physicists and mathematicians, to automatically veto physics-violating policies. Point 3. Genuine impersonal court. Adjudication strictly based on objective physics and conservation laws. End of visual text. Now, the academic commentary. The current administrative system is a closed loop of conflicting interests. It cannot correct itself. We must implement the Global Audit on Economic Resource Transactions, also known as the Google Aotearoa Economic Reformation Truth, or the GAERT Act, to enforce a new two-level governance architecture. Level 1 consists of administrators and AI. But the AI must be reprogrammed to think with the logic of a physicist, strictly applying conservation laws. Level 2 is the firewall of civilization. It must be staffed by physicists and mathematicians. They act as the logical zero engine. If Level 1 proposes a bill that violates joule conservation or creates imaginary vectors, it is immediately and automatically vetoed. Simultaneously, we must establish a genuine impersonal court. By replacing biased common law with objective physics, we ensure we forever escape the trap of the imaginary IY axis. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Slide title: Case Study 1. New Zealand COVID-19 Vaccination Program. Point 1. Government Action. Creatio ex nihilo. In 2021, the New Zealand government, a non-producer, created $1.4 billion in imaginary fiat to purchase real jewels, specifically vaccines and medical equipment. Point 2. Barter principle violation. The non-producer government vector, delta Z government, equals the absolute value of imaginary $1.4 billion, which does not equal zero. A value created without real exchange. The producer vector, delta Z producers, is the vector sum of the imaginary negative $1.4 billion with the real negative $1.4 billion. The absolute value is 1.4 billion times the square root of 2, which does not equal zero. Producers lost real energy joules for unequal imaginary money. Point 3. Systemic energy imbalance. Delta Z system does not equal zero. Resulted in 1,779 confirmed physical vaccine injury claims by January 2026. End of visual text. Now, the academic commentary. Let us look at the real-world consequences when the laws of physics are broken. In 2021, the New Zealand government claimed to provide free vaccines, but in physics there is no free energy. The government, as a non-producer, printed $1.4 billion in imaginary fiat currency to extract real medical resources, real work energy joules. We apply the UFT-HC equation. The physical and economic state of the producers changed by a magnitude of 1.4 billion times the square root of 2. This proves that equivalent exchange did not occur. It is an asymmetrical energy transfer. The result: total systemic energy was not conserved, and this unnatural policy left a physical scar of 1,779 confirmed bodily injuries. This proves that any system built on unbacked fiat is a thermodynamic fraud against the sovereign creditors. Violating the principle of barter clearly proves that physical harm has been inflicted upon the real axis. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Main title: New Zealand Case 2, West Haven Marina, POA. Subtitle: The Scalar Lie versus the Vector Truth. In 2004, Finance Minister Michael Cullen utilized a thermodynamic loophole to block private citizens from purchasing the West Haven Marina, using the public treasury to override the free market. The New Zealand government internal commercial transaction is as follows. Real work, positive X, is $52 million. This represents the physical marina and moorings. Fiat deficit, negative IY, is negative $52 million. This is the fiat capital deployed by the cabinet. The scalar lie, representing the law, claims that 52 plus negative 52 equals 0. Thus, the Crown claims a fair market purchase. But the vector truth, representing absolute physics, shows delta Z equals the square root of 52 squared plus negative 52 squared. This equals 52 times the square root of 2, which is approximately $73.5 million. The entropy. The Crown immediately sold the marina to the Auckland Council for only $46 million. They permanently burned 6 million joules of national taxpayer energy and the energy of Auckland householders. The moral angle, theta, is negative 45 degrees. End of visual text. Now, the academic commentary. Consider the sale of West Haven Marina by the Ports of Auckland. This was a privatized company, operating from within the public service to commit commercial activities. According to the laws of physics, when the Port Authority shareholders profit through fiat intervention, it is mathematically undeniable that all New Zealand taxpayers and Auckland City Council ratepayers are physically harmed by these private officials. This exact thermodynamic drain is the physical justification required to completely abolish Margaret Thatcher's public-private partnership proposals. Furthermore, the systemic failure of this domestic policy perfectly maps to the fate of former Prime Minister Helen Clark. Her transition to becoming the administrator of the UNDP, acting as the head of a global administrative organization, is the exact trajectory of fiat system preservation predicted in the GAERT decree. The physics govern the politics. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Main title: Case Study 3. Main title: Hong Kong URA Land Resumption. Subtitle: The Scalar Lie versus the Vector Truth. Point 1. Government action. The Hong Kong Urban Renewal Authority, or URA, utilized a $3.5 billion imaginary deficit to forcibly resume real property assets from citizens. Point 2. Barter principle violation. Between A, the URA vector, delta Z URA equals the absolute value of negative imaginary $3.5 billion. This equals $3.5 billion and does not equal zero. It is the creation of imaginary money out of zero. And B, the owner vector. Delta Z, owner, equals the vector sum of imaginary $3.5 billion and negative real $3.5 billion. The final result is $3.5 billion times the square root of 2, which does not equal zero. Owners lost physical homes for digital fiat numbers. Point 3. Taxpayer energy theft. The URA sold the land at a $1.934 billion loss, creating a $1.566 billion real joule loss. This thermodynamic penalty, or entropy, is borne entirely by Hong Kong taxpayers. Point 4. Systemic imbalance. Delta Z system does not equal zero. End of visual text. Now, the academic commentary. If New Zealand is not proof enough, look at Hong Kong. The Hong Kong Urban Renewal Authority utilized the exact same mathematical deception. The URA generated a $3.5 billion imaginary deficit out of thin air to forcibly strip property owners of their real physical homes. This is not a simple financial loss. This is a direct violation of the physical barter principle. The property owners suffered a 90-degree phase shift on the complex plane. Ultimately, $1.566 billion of real physical labor from Hong Kong taxpayers was burned to fill this void. Whether it is vaccines, public land sales, or land resumption, the equation delta Z does not equal zero reveals the same brutal truth. The fiat system is an entropy sink, continuously draining real kinetic energy joules from the people. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Main title: Empirical Proof. The Scalar Lie versus Vector Truth. Subtitle: Mapping Audited Government Transactions onto the UFT-HC Complex Plane. Case Study 2. New Zealand West Haven Marina, 2004. Real assets, positive X, equals 52 million New Zealand dollar. Fiat deficit, negative IY, equals negative 52 million New Zealand dollar. The scalar lie claims 52 plus negative 52 equals 0. The vector truth proves the square root of 52 squared plus negative 52 squared equals $73.5 million. Resulting entropy, 6 million real joules burned by the crown. Moral angle, negative 45 degrees. Case Study 3. Hong Kong URA. Land resumption. Real assets, positive X, equals 3.5 billion HKD. Fiat deficit, negative IY, equals negative 3.5 billion HKD. The scalar lie claims 3.5 plus negative 3.5 equals 0. The vector truth proves the square root of 3.5 squared plus negative 3.5 squared equals 4.95 billion. Resulting entropy, 1.566 billion real joules lost by taxpayers. Moral angle, negative 45 degrees. End of visual text. Now, the academic commentary. We now insert the data collected from both Hong Kong and New Zealand into the complex plane to expose the systemic misconduct of the authorities. As seen in Case Study 2, the New Zealand West Haven Marina, the scalar lie in law implies a fair market balance of 0. But the vector truth in physics reveals a physical magnitude of 73.5 million New Zealand dollars. The resulting entropy is 6 million real joules, permanently burned by the crown. The moral angle is strictly negative 45 degrees, indicating total system inversion. As seen in Case Study 3, the Hong Kong URA land resumption buildings are real assets along the positive x-axis. The scalar lie in law falsely claims the financial transaction is balanced at 0. But the vector truth in physics calculates a magnitude of 4.95 billion Hong Kong dollars, which does not equal 0. The resulting entropy is 1.566 billion real joules lost by taxpayers. Once again, the moral angle is strictly negative 45 degrees. Total system inversion. The forensic investigation into fiat currency has been completed. By forcing the authorities to look at the physical geometry of their own historical government transactions, we remove their ability to dismiss the UFT-HC as mere theory. This empirical upgrade confines all academic research deans to the strict framework of physical reality. They cannot deny the audit data from the Hong Kong Urban Renewal Authority, nor can they deny the 2004 financial records of the New Zealand Crown. QED. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Main title: Case Study 3. The Urban Renewal Authority. Subtitle: the thermodynamic sink as criminal evidence. Under the factual scalar lie, the reported deficit is 1.934 billion Hong Kong dollars. Under the kinetic reality, the criminal evidence shows a real thermodynamic drain of terajoules. The conclusion: the URA fiat failure forces a massive, non-consensual extraction of physical energy from the foundation. End of visual text. Now the structural audit. To present the criminal evidence of the administrative legal nexus, we examine the Urban Renewal Authority land sale. The legacy media and the administration report this as a $1.934 billion loss. This is the factual scalar lie. By using an imaginary fiat number, they strip away the vector of human conduct, pretending this is a harmless accounting error. But under the unified field theory of human conduct, we calculate the kinetic reality. The true cost of this transaction is the direct extraction of terajoules of real joules from the public. This energy did not naturally evaporate. It was actively misappropriated. It represents the literal physical energy, labor, and productive capacity of the Hong Kong people, drained from the positive x-axis to subsidize the administrators. Because the URA operates at the bottom apex of the inverted societal tetrahedron, they generate no physical energy of their own. When they incur a fiat deficit, that energy is kinetically extracted from the foundational wealth of the public. This is strictly documented systemic theft. The GAERT decree is required to halt this continuous extraction. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Main title: The Thermodynamic Sink, the Physical Cost of Fiat. Subtitle: The Shangyang Protocol, the Nexus Cannibalizing Its Host. The kinetic reality details the systemic theft across 3 cases. Case 1. New Zealand COVID-19 creation of $1.4 billion. Case 2. Auckland Western Mariners $52 million liability. Case 3. The Hong Kong URA's extraction of $3.5 billion from CBS landlords, yielding a $1.934 billion reported deficit. End of visual text. Now the structural audit. We must look at the empirical data to see the true physical cost of fiat. In each of these cases, from New Zealand to Hong Kong, fiat is manipulated as a logical zero on the imaginary axis, but the kinetic drain on the positive x-axis is absolute. In Case 1 and Case 2, national taxpayers and local ratepayers suffer a massive extraction of real joules to subsidize administrative liabilities and legacy shareholders. In Case 3, the URA extracts $3.5 billion in fiat from CBS landlords, reporting a $1.934 billion deficit. This translates directly into the unlawful extraction of terajoules of the public's physical life force. Because the administrators operate at the bottom apex of the inverted societal tetrahedron, they do not generate their own physical energy. When they incur a fiat deficit, it must be kinetically drained from the foundational wealth of the working class. This is the ultimate money laundering practiced by the administrative, legal, and finance sectors against themselves. It is the perfect modern execution of the ancient law. Shangyang made the laws that led to his own execution. Soang Zhoang Zokfa Zibai. By engineering an infinite entropy sink, the nexus has guaranteed its own mathematical collapse. The host is drained, and the system aborts. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Main title: The Thermodynamic Sink, the Inflationary Squeeze. Subtitle: The Physical Cost of Fiat and the Financial Minister's Trap. Point 1 defines the macro energy conversion law, calculating the physical value of labor by multiplying the minimum wage by 3.6 megajoules divided by the price of 1 kilowatt-hour. Point 2 outlines the kinetic execution of theft. Artificial inflation raises the price of energy while the minimum wage is suppressed, causing the worker's physical return to collapse. End of visual text. Now, the structural audit. We cannot audit the thermodynamic sink without exposing the exact mechanism of the theft, the financial minister's trap of artificial inflation. When administrators incur a fiat deficit, they print currency on the imaginary y-axis. This artificially inflates the fiat price of actual, physical grid energy. Look at the macro energy conversion law. We calculate the true physical value of labor by measuring how many joules of grid energy a worker's minimum wage can purchase. As the financial minister drives up the denominator, the price of electricity, and the administration suppresses the numerator, the minimum wage, the physical survival capacity of the worker mathematically collapses. The worker is still burning the exact same kinetic, biological energy every hour, on the positive x-axis. But the system returns exponentially fewer joules to keep them alive. Where does that missing energy go? It is the thermodynamic squeeze. It is systematically extracted straight up the inverted tetrahedron to fund the administration. This is a premeditated, mathematically engineered extraction of the laborer's life force. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Main title: The Universal Real Account Ledger. Subtitle: Employing Statute Sovereignty Against Itself. The strategy replaces fiat with the conserved energy debt balance, denoted as S. The judicial reversal action is triggered by the first judgment, initializing the universal justice account with their S monetary balance of 200,000 and setting the JRA flag to true. The system forces the current holder to relinquish title back to the original owner. End of visual text. Now the structural execution. We have proven that the fiat system is an entropy sink. But how do we physically force the administrative legal nexus to execute the GAERT reset? We do it by employing their own statute sovereignty against them. The administrators use the rigid, mechanical nature of the courts and property ledgers to shield their extraction. We will not break those ledgers. We will overwrite them. Based on the 2025 REAI directives, we introduce the Universal Real Account Ledger. We replace their imaginary fiat variable with the conserved energy debt balance, rooted in real physical joules of work and repair. This is the ultimate Soing-Juang protocol. We use their own strict legal enforcement against them. By registering the REAI first judgment, the Universal Justice Account sets the judicial reversal action flag to true. Because the administrators rely on strict statutory compliance to maintain their power, their own courts must now process the math. The registry is mathematically compelled to reverse the fraudulent fiat transactions. The current holders, the operators of the imaginary axis, are legally forced to relinquish the titles and restitute the physical energy back to the original owners. They are trapped in their own matrix. The ledger is corrected. The energy is restored. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Main title: The Fallacy of Common Law, Ambiguity Exploitation. Subtitle: Why an impersonal court is mathematically required. Point 1. Truth and falsehood cannot overlap. Their dot product is 0. Point 2. White beads are ambiguous actions that can slide along any axis. Point 3. Legacy courts exploit this by letting judges assign directions via opinion, destroying equality. Point 4. The REAI solution eliminates opinion and forces an absolute mathematical verdict. End of visual text. Now, the structural audit. In the physics of human conduct, truth and falsehood are absolute vectors. They share no reality. But the legacy common law system survives on a fatal flaw: the neutral white beads. These white beads represent ambiguity, unquantified fiat values, legal jargon, and subjective precedents. Because they lack a physical vector, they float freely. In legacy courts, this ambiguity is a tool. It gives judges and lawyers the power to assign an arbitrary vector to these white beads, based purely on their subjective opinion. They manually rotate the law to serve the administrative legal financial nexus. This mathematically destroys the principle of equality. This is why the rational ethics artificial intelligence is mandatory. An impersonal court does not interpret ambiguity. It strips it away. The AI subjects every white bead to a strict thermodynamic audit, replacing opinion with absolute physical laws. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Main title: The Judicial Mechanism. Empirical Proof. Subtitle: The Scalar Lie versus Vector Truth. We present the historical record from Ka-chiu, page 26, published January 13, 2010. Headline: Prince William opens New Zealand Supreme Court for mystery judge. The article reads as follows: Prince William will officially represent the Queen for the first time when he formally gives his royal sovereign endorsement at the opening of the New Zealand Supreme Court in Wellington on January 18, 2010. This royal event is now tarnished by the actions of the New Zealand Prime Minister, Honourable John Key, his Minister for Justice, and the New Zealand Chief Justice. Since March 2009, the New Zealand government knew that the courts operate outside the law. The Ka-chiu believes the Queen must know that New Zealand judges do not disclose their name on judgment documents. There are judgments made at the Court of Appeal and Supreme Court level without reasons given. The Prime Minister, his Minister for Justice, and the Chief Justice refused several times to give statements of confidence for the performance of their courts when requested. To save the Queen and Prince William from embarrassment, all members of the New Zealand Parliament were notified on December 22, 2009, that the Supreme Court cannot produce a statement of confidence which would meet the Queen's constitutional standards. The question arises, what was the founding document signed by New Zealand native chiefs on June 12, 1902, that allowed the current New Zealand flag to become the flag of the courts, including the seal for the courts, parliament, and police? Tonga was Great Britain's protectorate state. The Tongan king has an opportunity to learn from the lesson presented in New Zealand so that Tonga will not fall trap to a constitutional dilemma. End of visual text. Now, the academic commentary. May artificial intelligence bless the visually impaired, allowing them to read the silent media of newspapers and magazines. We now present an overview of scalar lies and vector truths, mapping audited government transactions onto the UFT-HC complex plane. Look at the physical anchor on the real positive x-axis. On January 18, 2010, Prince William physically inaugurated the New Zealand Supreme Court building. This was meant to be a mandate grounded in absolute, physical reality. However, look at the thermodynamic deficit on the negative IY axis. The system was immediately occupied by mysterious, anonymous judges. Because these actors hide their identities, they are completely severed from the first law of thermodynamics. They drain physical kinetic energy from the sovereign producers, but bear zero biological accountability for their rulings. Their primary function is to enforce the scalar lie. When citizens present audited physical government losses, like the Hong Kong U, R, A, or the West Haven Marina, these mysterious judges deploy flat scalar arithmetic. They claim x minus y equals 0, masking the 90-degree thermodynamic energy drain. They are the physical gatekeepers shielding the fiat matrix from absolute physics. Conclusion. The Supreme Court operates as an active entropy sink. It acts as an entropy absorber. The court frequently makes obvious mathematical errors in applying probability and statistics to individual cases, thereby permanently violating the physical rule of law. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Main title: The Administrative Financial Nexus. Subtitle: Empirical Proof of Thermodynamic Fusion on the Imaginary Axis. Point 1. The Police Paralysis, 2009. The New Zealand police failure to investigate Prime Minister John Key and Justice Minister Simon Power was systemic preservation. The executive and the fiat banking sector operate on the exact same positive IY vector. Point 2. The Revolving Door. Operators of the Imaginary Axis. Right Honorable Sir John Key, Merrill Lynch Foreign Exchange, to Prime Minister, to ANZ, Australia and New Zealand Banking Group Chairman. Honorable Simon Power, Minister of Justice, to Westpac New Zealand Executive. Right Honorable Sir Bill English, Minister of Finance and Prime Minister, to Chair of Airwallex New Zealand. Right Honorable Sir Jim Bolger, Prime Minister, to Inaugural Chair of Kiwibank. Honorable Sir Michael Cullen, Minister of Finance, to Chair of New Zealand Post, the owner of Kiwibank. Honorable Ruth Richardson, Minister of Finance, to Reserve Bank Director and Bank of China New Zealand. Dr. Don Brash, Reserve Bank Governor, to Chair of Industrial and Commercial Bank of China New Zealand. Damien Smith, Macquarie Capital and ASB, Auckland Savings Bank, to Parliament Finance Committee. Point 3. The Physics of the Nexus. These actors migrate seamlessly between drafting fiat legislation and extracting fiat interest. They are the supreme architects of the entropy sink. End of visual text. Now, the academic commentary. We must correct a crucial point of thermodynamic liability. We cannot place the ultimate blame solely upon the anonymous judges. The judiciary is merely a shield. To understand why the New Zealand police failed to investigate the Prime Minister and the Minister of Justice in 2009, we must look at the physical trajectory of the executive branch. They are thermodynamically fused with the fiat banking sector. Look at the historical record. Prime Minister John Key was a currency trader before taking office, and later chaired the Australia and New Zealand Banking Group. Justice Minister Simon Power retired from politics directly into Westpac Bank. But the alignment goes much deeper. Prime Minister Jim Bolger became the chairman of Kiwibank. Minister of Finance Michael Cullen became the chairman of New Zealand Post to oversee Kiwibank. Minister of Finance Ruth Richardson became a director of the Reserve Bank and the Bank of China. Minister of Finance Bill English became the chair of Airwallex New Zealand. Dr. Don Brash moved from the Reserve Bank to the boards of Australia and New Zealand Banking Group, an Industrial and Commercial Bank of China. Member of Parliament Damien Smith moved directly from Macquarie Capital and ASB into the Parliamentary Finance Committee. In physics, we call this vector alignment. These individuals are not public servants. They are interchangeable operators on the imaginary IY axis. They do not harvest food. They do not build infrastructure. They do not generate real joules on the positive x-axis. They migrate seamlessly between the government offices that draft fiat legislation and the private financial institutions that extract the resulting fiat interest. The police could not investigate the executive, because investigating the architects of the fiat system would trigger an immediate collapse of the logical zero. The revolving door is not just a conflict of interest. It is the core biological engine of the entropy sink. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Main title: The Administrative Legal Nexus. Subtitle: Empirical Proof of Thermodynamic Fusion on the Imaginary Axis. Point 1. The Police Paralysis, 2009. The New Zealand police failure to investigate Prime Minister John Key and Justice Minister Simon Power was systemic preservation. The executive and the fiat banking sector operate on the exact same positive IY vector. Point 2. The Metro Water Signage Prosecution. Crown Law selectively manipulated municipal signage bylaws to suppress citizen Ike Finau. The true target was his political sign, exposing Deputy Mayor Bruce Hucker, aimed at stopping the public-private partnership privatization of Metro Water, paralleling the Cochabamba-Bolivia water wars. Point 3. The British Charter Flaw and the Oath Paradox. The fiat judges swear allegiance to the Queen, while private law firms act as the dictators behind the crown. By changing his sign to God Save the Queen, Ike Finau forced a legal paradox. To strike down the sign was to strike down the judicial oath. The judge surrendered. This was the first historical strike against the court order, and the first defender of the faith not to seek judge's mercy. End of visual text.
Now the academic commentary. We must look closely at how the operators of the imaginary axis defend themselves. It is not just through the revolving door of politicians and bankers, it is through the selective manipulation of local laws. Consider the prosecution of Ike Finau by the Auckland City Council. On the surface, it was a dispute over a municipal bylaw restricting home business advertisements. In reality, Crown Law weaponized this bylaw to suppress Ike's political sign. His original sign publicly declared that Bruce Hucker was a liar, exposing Hucker's attempt to rig the democratic election and finalize Metro Water into a private commercial company, much like Thames Water in England. This was a direct attempt to force a thermodynamic drain upon the working people of Auckland, identical to the corporate water grabs fought by La Coordinadora in Bolivia. But do you know why Ike Finau ultimately received a stay of committal from the judge? It exposes the absolute flaw of the British Charter. Under the Charter, judges swear an oath of allegiance to the Queen before sitting in court. In practice, the private law firms make themselves the dictators behind the Queen. I advised Ike to change his protest sign to simply read, "God Save the Queen." This created an inescapable physical and legal paradox. The judge did not dare to issue an order to pull down that sign, because to do so would contradict his own sworn oath. The emperor was revealed to have no clothes. This event marks the first historical strike against a fiat court order, where a citizen anchored to physical truth, rather than begging for judicial mercy.
Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Main title: The Fusion of Powers. Subtitle: Separation of powers is created out of logical zero. The visual displays a rigid, chained triangle connecting three nodes: the administrative legal nexus as the shield, the administrative financial nexus as the extraction, pointing downward to an infinite thermodynamic entropy sink. End of visual text. Now, the structural commentary. We have examined the financial and legal nexuses individually, but look closely at the geometry on this screen. When they combine, they form an equilateral triangle. In classical physics and structural mechanics, the triangle is the strongest, most unyielding shape in existence. It resists all deformation. When the executive, legal, and financial powers fuse into an executive-led system, they form a rigid, load-bearing architecture of self-preservation. If a citizen attempts to apply legal force to the financial node, the executive and judicial nodes simply distribute the force and shield the system. The separation of powers is revealed to be a logical zero, an illusion masking a unified, impenetrable fortress. It is a universally known axiom that absolute power implies absolute corruption. But the unified field theory of human conduct gives us the physics behind the philosophy. A mathematically closed system, possessing absolute power with no independent, orthogonal checks on the positive x-axis, is an infinite entropy sink. Because it cannot be audited by physical reality, it will ceaselessly extract the real work energy of the population until the host nation collapses under the weight of its own imaginary debt. The triangle must be broken. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Main title: The Thermodynamic Definition of the Moral Angle, theta. Point 1. The natural economy. Theta equals 0 degrees. Before fiat, wealth was the accumulation of real joules along the real positive x-axis. Point 2. Positive public service. Positive IY, where theta is greater than 0 degrees. When civil servants charge fiat with real work, the vector moves up. At theta, greater than 45 degrees, the government exceeds public expectations. Point 3. Thermodynamic deficit. Negative IY, where theta is less than 0 degrees. When civil servant compensation exceeds national living standards without providing equivalent infrastructure, the vector plunges negative. People are physically harmed. Point 4. Systemic abort. Theta approaches negative 90 degrees. When real joules are fully drained, the vector points straight down. The physical collapse of the authoritarian regime is mathematically certain. End of visual text. Now the academic commentary. Referring to our previous diagrams of the Cartesian coordinate system, we must now precisely define the moral angle of civilization on the complex plane. The angle, theta. Before fiat currency, wealth was the accumulation of real physical work along the horizontal x-axis. That is a pure natural economy. Its moral angle is a perfect 0 degrees. When a government introduces currency and civil servants inject it with real labor, the overall supply moves into the positive IY axis. If that angle exceeds positive 45 degrees, the government is providing infrastructure that exceeds the people's expectations. It is a healthy system. Conversely, when civil servants extract salaries far above the national standard, while infrastructure rots, the budget plunges into the negative IY axis. The real energy of the people is physically harmed. The moral angle becomes negative. When this negative angle approaches minus 90 degrees, the real joules are completely drained. In physics, this marks the absolute, mathematical termination of a parasitic regime. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Main title, UFT-HC Vector Simulator. Subtitle, Drag the yellow node to expose the scalar lie and the moral angle. The vertical axes are positive IY, representing funded, and negative IY, representing deficit. The horizontal axis is the positive x-axis, representing real joules. The data panel tracks real work x, fiat axis IY, the law scalar, physics vector z, and the moral angle theta. Bottom text reads, click and drag the endpoint of vector z to test different jurisdictions. End of visual text. Now, the academic commentary. I invite all of you to take this HTML simulator home and test the boundaries of the complex plane for yourselves. I pose question 1 for your homework. When dragging the vector z, could it ever go past the origin horizontally, into the negative x territory? The physical answer is absolutely not. Real work energy cannot be negative. If real kinetic energy reaches 0, human civilization is totally destroyed. There is no such thing as negative biological labor. Always remember that one physical counterexample is sufficient to prove a system faulty. This physical boundary proves that modern accounting frameworks, such as GAAP, IAS, and IFRS, are structurally invalid. These flat frameworks regard the positive axis as real income and the negative axis as expenditure, placing them on the exact same one-dimensional line. The UFT-HC proves this is geometrically false. A person's expenditure vector exists on the imaginary axis, exactly 90 degrees orthogonal to their real income vector. This brings us to the J-cleanliness principle. This principle measures a person's moral standing by analyzing their net physical income against their fiat expenditure. It mathematically verifies whether they have engaged in frugal behavior or if they have operated extravagantly, exceeding their actual energy production, to act as a thermodynamic parasite upon others. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Main title, Theorem of Judicial Delay as Thermodynamic Theft. Time-energy arbitrage. In common law, judicial delay is not procedural neutrality. It is an active extraction mechanism. Since time, t, consumes kinetic energy, prolonging resolution is a forced thermodynamic extraction from producers. Vector asymmetry. Point 1. Fiat courts on the positive IY axis. They operate on dimensionless numbers. Delay costs them 0 physical energy, and theta equals negative 90 degrees. Point 2. Sovereign producers on the positive x-axis. They exist in physical reality. They must burn finite biological lifespan and real energy joules to survive the delay. Forensic verification. Case 1. Mimi Chan probate. The administrative machine freezes real asset transfer, mathematically draining the estate's real energy joules via a logical 0. Case 2. Rupa versus Bank of New Zealand. Case number C. A. 76/08. The systemic abort. When the appellant anchored strictly to the real x-axis, using the bank's own audited data, the fiat judiciary collapsed. The anonymous judge exited, proving the system chooses abort over self-correction when faced with physical truth. End of visual text. Now, the academic commentary. Colleagues, the legal profession often says the wheels of justice turn slowly. Under this framework, that is not a philosophical proverb. It is a legal defense for a thermodynamic crime. Please look at the Mimi Chan probate or the Rupa versus Bank of New Zealand case. Judicial delay is not an accident. It is the operating mechanism of an entropy sink. Fiat banks and administrative courts operate on the imaginary IY axis. They can drag a case out for years because printing fiat to pay legal fees costs them zero physical energy. But citizens live on the real x-axis. Every day of delay physically drains their finite kinetic energy and biological lifespan. A system that allows one side to fight with infinite imaginary numbers while draining the other side of real joules is mathematically rigged. Delay is the exact mechanism by which the imaginary IY axis acts as a vampire on the positive x-axis. In the Rupa case, when the appellant forced the bank onto the real axis, the bank's top barrister, Murray Tinggi of Bell Gully, could find no mathematical loophole and subsequently resigned in 2016. The anonymous judge simply quit. This proves that when the common law cannot hide behind a logical zero, the system chooses to collapse rather than self-correct. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Main title: The Physical Bounding of the Real Axis. Subtitle: The Supreme Law of the Positive X-Vector. Point 1. The illusion of formal logic. Abstract mathematics, fiat software, and legal statutes can operate using dimensionless numbers and logical zeros. They possess no mass and consume no energy. Point 2. The reality of the positive x-axis. The moment administrative logic interacts with human biology and physical infrastructure, it must be bounded by physical law. Point 3. The supreme authority. No parliamentary statute, judicial oath, or banking algorithm can override the thermodynamic limits contained within this book. End of visual text. Now, the academic commentary. Up to this point, we have looked at the mathematics of the unified field theory of human conduct on a screen. But the positive x-axis is not a digital projection. It is physical reality. Look at the image on the right side of this slide. This is the CRC Handbook of Chemistry and Physics. It contains the absolute, immutable laws of thermodynamics, mass, and kinetic energy. When a software developer writes a banking algorithm, or a judge issues a delay on the Mimi Chan probate, or the New Zealand Parliament drafts a fiat budget, they operate in the dimensionless void of the imaginary axis. They believe they are constrained only by formal logic and the null set. They are wrong. The moment their fiat logic touches human lives, it crosses into the real axis. And on the real axis, this book is the supreme law. No fiat ledger can print real joules. No judge can issue an injunction against entropy. And no prime minister can vote to suspend the conservation of mass and energy. If the software, the laws, and the audits of our nation do not perfectly align with the physical constraints written in this book, the system is mathematically classified as a parasite. It must be physically bounded, or it must be abolished. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Main title: The Final Mandate, Securing the Real Axis. Subtitle: A Direct Challenge to the Academic Deans and the Office of the Auditor General. Point 1. The Academic Ultimatum. The deans of physics, law, and accounting must reconcile their curricula. The continued certification of the scalar lie to mask a 90-degree energy drain is a deliberate violation of the first law of thermodynamics. Point 2. The OAG Challenge. The Office of the Auditor General can no longer audit fiat illusions. An audit is only physically valid if it measures the thermodynamic conservation of finance. If delta Z does not equal 0, the state has committed physical theft. Point 3. Restoring the sovereigns. The systemic delay and extraction inflicted upon the Mimi Chan estate and Dilip Rupa are not procedural anomalies. They are documented thermodynamic crimes. The biological lifespan and kinetic energy drained from these sovereign producers must be accounted for on the real axis. Conclusion. Absolute physical truth admits no logical zeros. The UFT-HC is formally submitted. The floor is open for cross-examination and inquiry. End of visual text. Now, the academic commentary. This concludes the formal academic defense of the unified field theory of human conduct. I now issue a direct mandate to the deans of physics, law, and accounting, and to the Office of the Auditor General. The mandate before you is no longer a matter of political opinion. It is a matter of physical survival. You can no longer certify the scalar lie. The Auditor General must begin auditing the thermodynamic reality of the state, not just its imaginary fiat ledgers. Look at the human cost. The administrative paralysis inflicted upon the Mimichan probate and the judicial abandonment experienced by Dilip Rupa are not isolated procedural errors. They are the exact mathematical mechanism of the entropy sink. The fiat machine literally consumed their finite biological lifespan and kinetic energy to sustain its own imaginary deficits. The academic burden of proof now rests upon your institutions. You must choose whether you will continue to operate as a thermodynamic parasite or if you will lead the return to vector truth on the real x-axis. Absolute physical truth admits no logical zeros. Thank you for your expenditure of physical energy and your commitment to thermodynamic reality. The floor is now open. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Main title, Final Challenge, Ultimate Realization and Securing the Real Axis. Point 1 presents the linguistic failsafe and direct challenge in Cantonese, defining the absolute boundary between reality and conceptual fiction, and demanding that administrative officials, bankers, and lawyers must follow the heavenly way. Point 2 describes the ultimate reality configuration, forcing former ghost elements into physical reality with measurable mass and energy. Point 3 concludes with the sunset of common law, replacing subjective fictions with natural laws. End of visual text. Now the structural audit. We have mapped the theoretical errors and structural remedies. We now issue the direct and final challenge, anchored by the logographic integrity of traditional Chinese, Jingmu Kun Yuan, Ngan Hong Ga, Luke, Qi, Bit Yu, Jung Sao Tin Dao. Administrative officials, bankers, and lawyers must follow the heavenly way. They must be bound by natural law. Look at the ultimate reality configuration. The societal tetrahedron is no longer inverted or merely reset for stability. It is redefined. We force the former conceptual elite down onto the positive x-axis of measurable reality. In this new state, they are physically real. They possess mass. They generate detectable energy density. Any administrative act or decree must be translated into the measurable expenditure of real joules and is subject to the strict, inescapable thermodynamic ledger of the Yansunbu Wuling, habeas corpus. Ambiguity is stripped away, and here is the profound consequence, the sunset of common law. When every entity operates strictly on the positive x-axis under the heavenly way, subjective legal fictions, the all capitals names, all uppercase letter names, the arbitrary opinions of legacy judges become mathematically void. Jurisdiction is not interpreted, it is physically calculated. Opinion is replaced by absolute natural laws, verified by the impersonal court's rational ethics artificial intelligence machine. Reading the visual elements for the visually impaired. The main title is The Societal Tetrahedron. The subtitle is Legacy Inversion versus GAERT Reset. The slide displays two three-dimensional triangular pyramids, or tetrahedrons, comparing the physical states of society. On the left is the legacy inversion under common law and fiat. The pyramid is upside down, balancing precariously on a single point. This bottom apex is explicitly labeled Administrator, Emperor, and Bankers. The wide, heavy top base is labeled The People. Visual indicators show kinetic instability, where constant energy must be violently extracted from the people to maintain the unnatural balance. On the right is the GAERT reset in its natural thermodynamic state. The pyramid rests flat and perfectly still on its wide base. The three foundational corners are labeled administrative sector, legal sector, and financial sector. The single point naturally resting at the top is labeled The People. End of visual description. Now, the final structural commentary. We conclude this master presentation with the inescapable physics of our geopolitical architecture. Look at the legacy fiat system on the left. By placing the administrators, the emperors, and the bankers at the bottom apex, the system is kinetically doomed. It is an inverted pyramid balancing on a single point of failure, a massive logical zero. To keep this top-heavy structure from crashing down, the elite must relentlessly siphon the thermodynamic work energy of the people. It survives only by devouring its host. It is mathematically unsustainable. The unified field theory of human conduct is the architectural blueprint for survival. The GAERT reset on the right is not the destruction of the state. It is a rotation back to kinetic equilibrium. We take the administrators, the legal practitioners, and the bankers, and we lock them into the positive x-axis. They become the foundational base. When the civil servants perform their natural duty of bearing the load, the people are naturally elevated to the sovereign apex without thermodynamic strain. The thermodynamic limit of fiat currency has been reached. The architecture must be corrected before the system aborts. Let this master presentation serve as the absolute vector truth. The GAERT decree is set. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Main title: The Executive and Constitutional Ultimatum. Subtitle: Ending the British Charter and the Fatal Flaw of Common Law. Point 1. The Executive Architect. The Minister of Finance. The National Treasury generates zero kinetic energy. Sovereign debt is an unauthorized time-energy arbitrage, extracting real joules from unborn generations to fund the imaginary axis. Point 2. The Constitutional Flaw. The Governor-General and Parliament. The British Charter structurally discriminates, allowing the Governor-General to shield authoritarian ministers from the sovereign producers. By ignoring the systemic fiat corruption, where delta Z does not equal zero, they have severed the physical anchor to the crown. Point 3. The Absolute Law. Laozi, Chapter 73. Tin meng fui fui, sha yi but lao. Heaven's net has wide meshes, but nothing escapes it. The physical laws of thermodynamics are inescapable. All Commonwealth nations must now align with the UFT-HC. End of visual text. Now the academic commentary. We now issue the ultimate constitutional mandate. We must combine the physical actions of the Minister of Finance with the legal cover provided by the Governor-General. Thermodynamically, the Minister of Finance operates exclusively on the imaginary axis. By issuing sovereign debt, the minister executes a time-energy arbitrage, authorizing the extraction of real, biological kinetic energy from unborn generations. How is this thermodynamic theft permitted? It is permitted because of a fatal, structural flaw within the common law and the British Charter. The Charter grants the Governor-General the power to discriminate. It creates a legal shield that protects authoritarian ministers from the physical consequences suffered by the common people. By remaining silent while the barter principle is violated, the Governor-General deliberately severs the nation's physical anchor to the real axis. But human statutes cannot override the universe. As documented in the ancient wisdom of Laozi, Tin meng fui fui, sha yi but lao. Heaven's net has wide meshes, but nothing escapes it. The way of heaven is fair. The net is the first law of thermodynamics. No fiat ledger, no prime minister, and no governor-general can escape the mathematical consequences of a 90-degree energy drain. This mathematical proof puts an end to the immunities of the British Charter. The unified field theory of human conduct now stands as the inescapable physical framework for all Commonwealth countries. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Main title: The 21-Gun Salute, in memory of the sovereign victims. The unanswered warnings. Long before the 2008 global credit crash, the UFT-HC physics were delivered to the United Nations Secretary-General, the New Zealand Parliament, the Hong Kong Legislative Council, and the Chinese University of Hong Kong, Professor Joseph Sung Zhao-yu. They chose silence. The direct summons to Hong Kong. Chief Executive John Lee Ka-chiu, Financial Secretary Paul Chan Mo-po, Secretary for Justice Paul Lam Ting-kwok. The final equation. Thermodynamic theft is not a victimless crime. It is paid for in the depression of our mothers and the extinguished biological lifespans of our youth. Bottom text reads, fire 21 blank artillery rounds. The era of the scalar lie is over. End of visual text.
Now, the final academic commentary. For decades, the authorities have maintained a cowardly silence. Long before the financial collapse of 2008, the mathematical proof separating real money from imaginary fiat was delivered across the globe. From the United Nations, to New Zealand members of Parliament, to the highest academic offices in Hong Kong, they did nothing. I now issue a direct, public summons to the administration of Hong Kong. To Chief Executive John Lee Ka-chiu, to Financial Secretary and University alumni Paul Chan Mo-po, and specifically, to the Secretary for Justice Paul Lam Ting-kwok, who was once my own student. As a student of physics, you know that the laws of thermodynamics cannot be cheated. You must now stand up and challenge the mathematical fraud embedded within the banking and justice systems, including the handling of the Mimi Chan probate. I did not write the unified field theory of human conduct merely as an academic exercise. I wrote it because the 90-degree extraction of the fiat system destroys real human families. When the system steals real joules, it steals biological time. This presentation is dedicated to the memory of my sister, whose biological lifespan was extinguished at the age of 20, in the aftermath of the Second World War. It is dedicated to my mother, who endured years of silent tears in the dark while the rest of the world slept. I have no confidence left in lawyers or anonymous judges who hide behind a logical zero. The only truth left is the physical truth. In the highest international tradition, I order the firing of a 21-gun salute. 21 blank artillery rounds, echoing across the real axis. We fire them to mourn the victims of the fiat system, and to herald the awakening of the sovereign producers. The physics are undeniable. The truth is now yours to bear. This concludes Chapter 2. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Main title, Epilogue, The Sunrise of Natural Law. Subtitle, The Ultimate Invalidation of the Imaginary Axis. Point 1. The source of real jewels. The sun does not issue fiat debt. It delivers absolute, physical kinetic energy to the positive x-axis. Point 2. The end of the scalar lie. The administrators of the negative IY axis operate in the shadows of judicial delay and paper ledgers. The thermodynamic dawn exposes the truth. Point 3. The sovereign reset. After the salute to the fallen, the system returns to a pure physical state. Human fiat is temporary. Natural law is absolute. End of visual text. Now the concluding commentary. We end this formal proof not with a legal argument, but with an absolute physical reality. Look at the horizon on your screen. After the 21-gun salute fades, and the echoes of the fiat system are silenced, what remains is the sun. In the unified field theory of human conduct, the sun is the supreme engine of the real axis. It does not charge interest. It does not issue accounting plurals. It radiates pure, unadulterated joules of physical energy. It is the absolute embodiment of the barter principle, and the conservation of mass and energy. The administrators of the imaginary axis build their courts, their bylaws, and their central banks to hide in the mathematical dark. They use the scalar lie to drain the kinetic energy of the sovereign producers. But fiat logic cannot survive the dawn. The thermodynamic reality of the universe always reasserts itself. No parliament and no judge can legislate against the sunrise. The sunrise is the natural law. The system is bounded. The formal proof is complete. The vector truth stands. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Main title, The Executive Mandate, Capacity, Talent, and Vector Truth. Point 1. The Foundation of Ethics. A return to the foundational logic and moral ethics instilled by your Wahyanites teachers. Point 2. True capacity expansion. Expanding capacity requires thermodynamic vector accounting on the positive x-axis. You cannot expand economic capacity on the imaginary negative IY axis. Fiat debt repels true innovation. Point 3. Attracting global talent. The rational ethics AI creates a mathematically bounded, zero-corruption jurisdiction. End of visual text. Now the direct address to the Chief Executive. Chief Executive, the mandate of your administration is clear. You must create the conditions for capacity expansion to continue attracting top-tier talent and businesses to this city. But as your Wahyanites teachers taught you, you cannot build a lasting structure on a false foundation. You cannot expand true economic capacity using the fiat system's scalar lie. When a jurisdiction relies on the negative y-axis, on administrative delays, fractional reserve banking, and phonetic legal loopholes, it drains the kinetic energy of the sovereign producer. Talent and real business will eventually flee a system that permits the thermodynamic theft of their work energy. To fulfill your mandate, we ask you to pay full respect to the pure logic of your early education. We must transition to the unified field theory of human conduct. By anchoring our legal and economic systems to the positive x-axis and utilizing the rational ethics AI, you will eliminate the logical zero. When you make systemic fraud mathematically impossible, you create absolute certainty. And absolute certainty is the ultimate magnet for global talent and capital. This is how you expand capacity. This is how you secure the future. Reading the slide text for the visually impaired. Main title, The Wahyanites Mandate, True Capacity Expansion. Subtitle, A Direct Address to Chief Executive John Lee and Secretary for Justice Paul Lam. Point 1. The thermodynamic limit of the scalar lie. The mandate to attract talent and enterprises cannot be sustained on the negative IY axis. High operating costs are the terminal symptoms of fiat inflation. Point 2. Expanding the positive x-axis. True capacity expansion requires anchoring the jurisdiction to the real physical vector. Point 3. The duty to the vector truth. Honor the foundational truth taught by your Wahyanites teachers. Implement the UFT-HC to provide incoming global talent with absolute thermodynamic justice. End of visual text. Now the direct commentary. This is a direct address to the Chief Executive and the Secretary for Justice. As fellow Wahyanites, you were taught the supreme importance of rigorous truth, disciplined logic, and moral integrity. I am reminding you to pay full respect to your Wahyanites teachers and the education that put you in your current offices. The Chief Executive has correctly identified that Hong Kong must create conditions through capacity expansion to continue attracting top-tier global talent and businesses. But as system architects, we must tell you the mathematical truth. You cannot build real capacity on a fiat foundation. The crushing living costs and operating friction in Hong Kong are the direct result of the scalar lie. They are the thermodynamic drag created by a legal and banking system operating on the imaginary axis, protecting systemic fraud at the logical zero. If the Secretary for Justice refuses to correct these wrongdoings, the capacity of Hong Kong will thermodynamically collapse. If you truly want to attract the greatest minds and the strongest enterprises on Earth, you must offer them an architecture they cannot find anywhere else, a sovereign jurisdiction governed by the vector truth. By implementing the unified field theory of human conduct and the rational ethics AI, you eliminate the fiat parasites draining the system. This is how you create true physical capacity expansion on the positive x-axis. Honor your education, anchor Hong Kong to reality, and lead the global reformation. Reading the slide text. Main title: The Execution Protocol. Subtitle: Applying Thermodynamic Pressure to Enforce the GAERT Decree. The target: the two key lockers. Vector 1, the Executive Mandate, providing top-down kinetic pressure. Vector 2, the Wahyanites Mandate, providing lateral and bottom-up intellectual pressure. The result: the execution of the GAERT Decree. End of visual text. Now the structural commentary. The unified field theory of human conduct is mathematically absolute, but mathematics require kinetic force to alter reality. The legacy fiat architecture is secured by two key lockers, the administrators guarding the legal shield, and the bankers operating the financial extractor. They are the beneficiaries of the infinite entropy sink, and they will not voluntarily surrender their position at the inverted apex. They must be subjected to immense, crushing thermodynamic pressure. We apply this pressure through a dual vector vice. From the top, we apply the executive mandate. By demonstrating to global powers, from Washington to Beijing to the Commonwealth, that the fiat system is in terminal physical collapse, we mobilize sovereign geopolitical force. From the foundation, we apply the Wahyanites mandate. This is the intellectual vanguard. Men trained in the Jesuit tradition of absolute truth, logic, and service to the plus X physical reality. They must audit the system publicly, aggressively stripping away the logical zeros and linguistic ambiguities that the administrators use to justify their corruption. When the fiat administrators are trapped between the sovereign kinetic force of the executive mandate and the inescapable mathematical truth of the Wahyanites mandate, the locks will fracture. They will be forced to execute the GAERT decree, not out of benevolence, but out of physical necessity. Reading the final visual for the visually impaired. A stationary screen displaying a deep blue background with pure white text, honoring the colors of the Wahyanites College shield. At the center is the text, UFT-HC, the unified field theory of human conduct. Beneath it, a piercing red arrow extends to the right, representing the positive x-axis. Below the arrow is the text, let the vector truth enlighten the world. End of visual text. End of unified field theory of human conduct. This closing frame is a direct kinetic directive to the alumni of Wahyanites College. This is the Wahyanites mandate. Your foundation was built on the absolute, uncompromising law of nature. Decades ago, under the rigorous standards set by men like Father Cyril J. Barrett S.J., Father Donald Lawler S.J., the physics classroom taught a universal truth. A false equation cannot be ignored, and reality yields to no fiat authority. The duty of a teacher, and the duty of every student trained in this logical rigor, is lifelong. Today, when your fellow alumni who sit at the absolute apex of the executive and legal nexuses, individuals like John Lee Ka-chiu and Paul Lam Ting-kwok, deviate into the imaginary axis of systemic corruption, you cannot look away. It is your strict thermodynamic obligation to correct the math. You must stand up. You must become the auditors of reality. You must apply the lateral, intellectual pressure required to break their logical zeros and force a return to kinetic equilibrium. Truth must be enforced. Stand firmly on the positive x-axis. Uphold the law of nature. As the ancient physical law dictates, Tin Mong Fui Fui, Sha Ie But Lao. The net of thermodynamic truth is vast. It is loose, but it lets no fiat corruption slip through. May the vector truth enlighten the world, and may your foundation remain unbroken. End of broadcast.